It is 9:30 on my clock, so we will go ahead and get started with our call to order for today's Policy Committee meeting on December 13th. Up next, we have our approval of the November 20th Policy Committee draft meeting minutes. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay. Anybody have any questions or comments about the minutes? Okay, so all those in favor, either raise your hand or say aye or both.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that is unanimous. And so we will move on to 1.03 public comment. We did not receive any written public comment that I'm aware of or that is attached to our agenda item. Do we have anybody in the meeting who wishes to make public comment? I don't see anybody outside of our folks on the call. So we will move on to 1.04, Policy 101, Organization of the Board.
So before I dive into 101, just a reminder that we are recording the Google Meet just like we would be recording an in-person meeting. So the recording will be available in the future for public consumption.
Thank you.
So Policy 101, Organization of the Board. This was a request made by originally Mr. Bass, and we've had some excellent discussion about this policy. Originally, we were focusing on student member of the board and on changes to the process for electing officers. And so I am here to present what we have. Of course, we are applying the new template to the board, and we've added definitions of advisory committee, Board of Education of Frederick County Public Schools, and officers. These are definitions that in our research, Ms. Chesney and I found that other LEAs incorporated these or similar definitions, and we felt it was appropriate to incorporate them into our policy. Are there any questions regarding the definitions? No? Okay. So we added a new policy statement. There was an existing policy statement regarding the importance of community participation, but we also wanted to add a policy statement regarding the student member of the board, because the student member of the board is a member of the board, and this being the board organization of the board policy, it made sense to us to incorporate a statement that we believe that the board believes the student member plays an important role as well as the community. Any questions about the policy statement? No? Okay. So this is where you're going to see the crux, the bulk of the changes. We articulated for the first time here that the board will actually have a president and vice president. There was never a specific statement that said there was going to be a president and vice president. There was an election of one. There are references to them, but there was never the actual statement. And we identified here that the superintendent shall serve as the secretary to the board. We then articulated the election of officers procedure. First, a meeting in administrative function to make sure that everyone is aware of the election procedures, to propose any changes to the procedures, and to complete the portion of the process which is within the scope of the administrative function. We articulate that the process shall follow Robert's Rules of Orders, just like we do with respect to our meetings. At the public meeting, the superintendent shall receive the nominations. They may be self-made or made by another member. If made by another member, they actually have to be accepted. And that the nominee does not need to be physically present to nominate or accept the nomination from another board member. And this is really a nod to the very circumstance we had last week when Mr. Bass, you were traveling. And that should not, from our perspective, preclude you from participating as an officer simply because you could not be physically present on the day of the board meeting.
I think the text message vote went just fine. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, and that's reflected in the next section, the next point, that the board member vote shall be by secret written ballot. to elect the board president. A board member who's unable to be physically present may participate via telephone or virtually and may communicate their vote in writing to the superintendent and the board's executive assistant. I didn't say specifically text message. It could be email or any other instant message format that we all commonly use. The results shall be tallied by the superintendent and the board's executive assistant with each vote called out early, which is exactly how it was handled this past week. The individual receiving a majority of votes shall be declared to be elected. If there is no majority, you repeat. And if you repeat, the original nominees remain unless someone withdraws. If there is only one candidate, the candidate is declared to be elected on unanimous consent and without a vote. And then once the board president process is completed, the process is repeated for the vice president position. Questions about this process that I've outlined?
I do have one, I don't know, question or comment. And it's really so under little I there, the board meeting and administrative function, does this also allow for future boards to meet an administrative function and potentially have some discussion about a change to the election process? So say that in administrative function, the majority of the board members preferred a more public-facing discussion of their interest in board leadership. Does this policy allow for that discussion to happen in administrative function and allow that future board to say, we actually want to be more public-facing in our process for this year or something like that?
It does. I was very intentional in not addressing the opportunity for candidates to articulate the whys and wherefores for their interest in being an officer. It was very intentional that it did not say that it could be done, that it would be done in admin function or in the public facing, because we know that it can be part of the admin function process. And that's why it's phrased with complete that portion of the process, which is within the scope of the admin function. That gives you the ability to do that kind of conversation internally. But because the policy is silent in directly on where a statement of interest might be presented, the board could meet in admin function and decide that they want to do that as part of the public election before the nominations are received or after the nominations are received. It gives you that flexibility to hold it privately in admin function or publicly. Mr. Bass?
But this would also allow a board to decide we will not have any kind of forum for officer candidates.
Yes, the board would also have that flexibility as well. And it may be that there's no, if it looks like there's only going to be one candidate, or everyone's happy with, the sitting president, and the sitting president wants to continue for a second year or a third year, and there's no real need to have that conversation, then the board can decide, you know what, we don't need that conversation because we know where this leadership is going and we like the leadership we have.
I think that's not specific enough for me to support this. I think it's very important that we have a forum for officers to announce their intentions and their reasons for running. I think the narrow scope that we had this year could be sufficient. Or a little broader if the law allows for either more general questions from the board or even from the public, more likely from the board. But it's to say, I think it helps the board to have a forum for candidates, for officers to express their intentions. And I feel like this is a little too loose in this does not prescribe that.
And Mr. Bass, that was intentional, because while this particular board made that determination that it wanted to do that, a future board may make the determination that it does not want to do that. And what I'm trying to avoid is requiring a policy rewrite every time we get a board, because this board decides, well, we want that, and then the next board decides we don't. The way it's drafted intentionally with that flexibility to allow for that kind of public comment, or I mean, not public comment, that kind of statement of intention, either privately or publicly, or not at all, depending on what the board decides for that year.
Yeah, I mean, well, I spoke, maybe Mr. Rosen.
Yeah, first, thank you to Ms. Gallagher for kicking this off. I appreciate her raising these concerns, and I want to thank Mr. Bass for his comments. And he has actually championed a more transparent process for the last 3 years, so I appreciate that. I too would like us to be a little more specific. My reasoning is we have an opportunity here. We've brought forth the policy. We have an opportunity as a full, it will go before a full board. We have a full board, in my opinion, to take some of the politics out of politics. Because if we leave it open-ended here, then in essence, frankly, every reiteration of the board will, in administrative function every year, redecide how this process will go. Personally, I would much prefer the candidate forum to be in public meeting. I think that made our process less transparent, not more transparent. And I think that was the ultimate goal that Mr. Bass raised all along. I think it limited the opportunity for board members to inquire. I don't see anything wrong with putting time limits on the discussion. We don't want it to go on and on and on, but I think it should be open to the public. I believe it brings a level of transparency, and I believe we have an opportunity as a board here. If the board doesn't agree, it's like any policy that we set. Every policy we set, I prefer clarity, and I would prefer clarity in this policy. And then if future boards feel differently, they will have a process that they will need to go through in order to make this change publicly. Because if you're constantly making this change in admin function, I believe that subverts the actual goal of policy, which says we're going to be upfront and public about this. We have a policy. If future boards want to change the policy, they'll have to do so in an open forum, just like we're doing today. So I support Mr. Bass's thoughts on that. I'd like to have some more clarity in the little I section about how we're going to go about this. And my preference is in open meeting. So thank you.
I mean, I hear two members of the panel. Ms. Gallagher, do you want to weigh in? Or, I mean, I've got two, so I can take that as my marching instructions for how to further revise this section. But I would be happy to hear from Ms. Gallagher and from Ms. McNeish.
I am a little bit torn. I think that both Mr. Bass and Mr. Rose made really great points. And I do think that the intention of us even looking at and revising this section was to increase transparency in the process of determining leadership. What I like about how you framed it is that there does allow for some flexibility of current boards, but I also understand that some of that flexibility might mean that we just continue to be non-transparent in our process. So I would certainly be in favor of updating this language to be more specific about a forum and process. And I am not opposed to it being a more public-facing process. My concern is whether, I think we're gonna hear from our fellow board members once we bring this to the full board, and I think that's worth having the discussion publicly as well. So let's go for it.
Can I just jump in? I agree that I appreciate the effort to bring it to the public forum. And I think some of the examples that I think you all have brought forth about, well, if there's only one person running, or, one person is nominated for one position, another person, and there's not a lot of discussion or no one else is interested, then certainly it doesn't have to take a lot of time. during those meetings. But I do agree. I think the more transparency, even if it doesn't, like I said, if it doesn't take a lot of time, and if there's a lot, 8 people want to be the president of the board, well, then I guess you do need to add some time limits to that discussion. But I 100% agree with pushing it forward. And you can set some parameters for that discussion, but there's never been harm in having these discussions in a public forum. And it only comes back, I think, in a positive light to the board to say, we're not having behind closed doors discussions about things that other people need to know. So I agree with pushing it out into the public forum.
So typically, a regulation for implementation of a policy is prepared by the superintendent, because it is the superintendent that is implementing the will of the board. In this particular instance, it would not be the superintendent, it would be a board regulation to implement the will of the board through the policy. I will make the changes that you're asking for, but I'm also going to investigate whether there is room for a board regulation that requires less effort to make a modification to the process. Because Mr. Rose, I understand, the idea that you're presenting, and I certainly appreciate it. We know that changing a policy, even under the more expedited process that we've implemented, that this board has implemented, still takes several months, 3 to 4 months potentially. And that is, I am concerned about tying future boards' hands in ways that make it very difficult to administer. But I'm going to make the changes that you all have asked me to, but I'm also going to investigate whether it's feasible to do a board regulation separate and apart from a superintendent's regulation. Mr. Bass?
I'm slightly concerned, actually, that, this is the first time I've ever heard you speak about a board regulation. And I guess it's to say that you're hearing very directly from 2 members of the policy committee that we want this in the policy. Ms. Gallagher spoke to both sides of this. And Ms. McNeish spoke to the need or the interest to have this in the policy. So, I think it should go in the policy. I don't know that it's a negative that future boards would have to change the policy. That's the way every policy works.
So, Mr. Bass, as I indicated, I will make the changes that the policy committee has asked me to make. But I view it as part of my job to present as many options for you as possible. In fact, that's one of the very items on the analysis form. What other options were considered in creating the policy, right? That is something that we included in our policy analysis. So in the spirit of that policy analysis, I'm going to explore whether there are, in fact, the possibility of a board regulation. You've never heard that before, because I don't know that it's ever been done before. I don't know that it's even possible to do a board regulation. It may not even be feasible, but I'm going to explore the possibility because I think that is consistent with the direction that the board has given in policy development. Mr. Rose?
Yes, I appreciate when we make the changes we're proposing to the policy. I appreciate the fact that you are doing your due diligence so that when it goes before the full board for first reading, we can actually share that we've looked at multiple avenues, multiple options. Then we'll have the opportunity before the full board to voice our thoughts and feelings about why in policy we chose to go this way. So no, I appreciate the due diligence, and I also appreciate you hearing the will of the members of the policy committee. And I appreciate that. And obviously the good news is there's no hurry. We won't be rolling around for another board leadership election for nearly a year. So I think it's important that we work on this. We get it right. I have some strong feelings that I'll be happy to share before the full board when it comes up for first reading. So thank you for that. I appreciate the due diligence.
So are there any other questions or comments with respect to the election process section? No? Okay, so then let me bring you down to the board president section. What I have added here is really a collating of what already existed elsewhere in a single place that describes the board president's authority. So the three bullets or the three items in black text already existed in the policy. They were there. I'm just moving them here so they're all aggregated together. The first is a statement, and there should be no period after the C. I will fix that typo, or after the word board president. This is just an articulation of the board president's authority to sign, to run the meetings, to sign documents and contracts, or to delegate those responsibilities to the superintendent, and then to perform other duties as prescribed by law. And then the addition in paragraph little v or paragraph 5, this actually comes out of the appeal and hearing policy 105. I thought it would be relevant to articulate it in both places, since this is a statement of board president responsibilities. And then D is an addition for just in the absence of the board president, the board vice president shall perform the duties of the president. Again, there was no just clear, specific articulation that the vice president will step in when the president is unavailable. Mr. Bass?
Excellent additions, I think, worth discussing among us. I think last year, Ms. Johnson and Mr. Rose worked really collaboratively in deciding committee assignments. And I believe Ms. Yoho and Ms. Gallagher are working collaboratively in that way. So it may make sense to say that the board president and vice president will work together annually to designate board members to serve on advisory committees.
Mr. Rose?
I promise that Mr. Bass and I did not speak prior to this meeting, but I have the same suggestion. I would like to see CII moved to number 3 under advisory committees, and I would prefer it read board leadership shall annually designate board members to serve on advisory committees. I agree. I believe that's been done collaborative almost every year in the past. I just think it would be good to articulate it in our policy that the board president and vice president will collaborate on those positions.
Should that maybe be pulled out from under board president then?
Yes, that's what I was saying, is move it under 3 advisory committee. It should be the first line under advisory committees.
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
Yep. That is an easy change. Okay.
And I wanted to reiterate, that appears to already be happening. It happened last year. It's happening again this year, but I just think it would be smart to articulate it for future boards.
Yep. So that brings us then, if there are no other questions or comments on this section, to section 3, the advisory committees. The struck through language is now living in the policy statement section above. So it's not really deleted, it's just relocated. Previously, it was each committee was presented, but there was no single list of all of the committees. I thought it would be helpful to see all of the committees that are pre-existing in one place. So I have created a list and put them all together. the information in the Section C, advisory committees to the board will comply with provisions of the Maryland Open Meetings Act. This is a requirement under the law, so it's just articulating the expectation. There really aren't changes to the substance of what the committees do except with respect to the ethics panel, which clarifies that it serves as an independent body whose responsibilities include, and that the FLAC committee has been revised to be consistent with the changes that were made by the board 2 board meetings ago. The rest is there's really no change to them other than to give them section headers. And then I did not propose any changes to the student member section because when we were first talking about this, there was the talk about proposing legislation to support a student member getting the voting rights. That has been tabled in favor of a statewide legislative proposal. We will have to come back to this policy at some point once that legislation is either enacted or not enacted. But given the current status of the legislation, I'm not proposing that we make any changes to this section. We do articulate the importance in the policy statement, though, of the student members' participation. And then, Mr. Bass?
The language is probably sufficient, but I do think in practice, there's been times that there are, say a board retreat, for example. I have rarely, if ever, seen a student member invited to a board retreat. And so I guess that's the question. Under this policy as written, the student member could be invited to a board retreat. It would just be up to leadership to invite them.
Yes.
So I think this language is sufficient, but yeah, I think there's ways in practice we can be more inclusive of the student member. Yeah.
All right. So then,
belabor the point, but I mean, I'm curious if my colleagues would want any more specific language regarding that, since we have seen how rare it is to include the student member in times like that.
I'll agree with that. I think it would be interesting to add some language in there that, like I think Mr. Bass mentioned, at the discretion of board leadership, the student member may be invited to closed session, admin function, and/or board retreats. Because I think there are things we discuss, like we talk about personnel and things like that in closed session or admin function, but there are also issues at times we could identify that the student member might have some valuable input during those meetings, and at the discretion of board leadership, they could be invited.
I can certainly make that edit if that's the will of the committee.
I think we could certainly include it. I was just scrolling back through the policy to see whether there was any definitions of the type, like different types of meetings that we as a board engage in also, because I was thinking that would fit, and there's not necessarily, which I don't know that we need to add that, but that, I mean, Mr. Rose's comments about just adding that to the student member made me consider whether we had any of that in the policy regarding just board member responsibilities around the various meeting types, because community listening sessions that we've added to as part of our policy review would also fall under that, that we encourage our student member to participate in those as well. So I think we could add it under the student member and or just considering whether we need to do any cross-referencing to the various types of meetings that the board engages in.
So we don't define admin function or closed session or any of the, we also don't define them in policy 102 policy 102. The numbers are all flowing through my head. Yeah, policy 102. We don't define those in policy 102 either. We recognize them in the agenda, but that's it. And we define community listening session because we created it when we revised policy 102. But closed session and admin function, they're not defined anywhere. If that is something the board is interested in us including, we can add them either here or we can include that in a revision to policy 102.
I love that idea. I think it would be a great opportunity, again, to be more transparent and open. We could just add that to either whichever my colleagues believe, whichever of the policies we choose, we could just add that to the definitions portion of the policy. And I just think that would be, I think we get a lot of people ask us, well, why are they going into admin function? Why are they going into closed session? So I think it would be great to define that in one of the two policies.
I mean, what I would suggest is let's define it here. And then when we get to our next review of 102, whether it's for other substantive changes or because it's a part of the regular review cycle, we incorporate the definitions there as well. There's no harm in having definitions in multiple places.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then that would make more sense to me that in the student member section, we referenced where, there were opportunities to encourage more student member engagement in, the various types of meetings that we have, including our board retreats.
Okay. So then we end with our related information broken down as we have been doing. We've designated the responsible office as the Board of Education because there's really no other office to designate for that. And that information will actually become more important and informative when we get to the very last item on our agenda. And you'll understand why when we get there. So it looks like we have some further revisions to do, and we will bring this back to the policy committee for further consideration at the next policy committee meeting.
Sounds good.
All right, so that brings us to 105, political activity. We are here, I feel like, for the 6th time, I think, on this policy. No one will ever say we have not given a thorough review of this policy. There were some changes requested during the initial first reading, and then when we met the last time, and here is in the text in purple is where we have articulated those changes. So we are adding a policy statement that it is the board's preference that FCPS facilities and likenesses are not used as part of election material. That was a statement that the board requested. We all understand that that is really not something we can necessarily enforce, but it is what the board's interest is. Scrolling down, you can see we went back to the during an employee's work time, which was what the board had discussed at the prior meeting. We have largely eliminated the voter registration text that had been originally proposed. We are now limiting it to any partisan or nonpartisan group that seeks to sponsor a voter registration drive must receive written permission from the deputy superintendent or their designee. We did leave in and should not contact the principal or school directly, and that is to help us keep the access for those centralized and not scattered throughout the district. And that the superintendent is directed to provide a regulation to establish a procedure for processing such requests. All of the rest of that comes out. That seemed to be the direction that the board and the policy committee wanted to go. I see some thumbs up. I see Mr. Bass nodding his head. Other than adding cross references to the FCPS regulations, this is where we're taking out this section, because remember, we discussed this at the last policy committee meeting, that this section is kind of irrelevant because we can incorporate that into the related information, which did not previously exist in our template. So if this looks good to the members of the panel, we can advance this back to the board for a second reading on January 24th tentatively.
Mr. Blivis, I hope you can hear me.
We can, Ms. Sergo, Dr.
Okay.
Sergo.
Yes, sorry. I'm at Brunswick High School and was unable to log in on my computer completely. I just wanted to also note the change we discussed, and I apologize if I didn't hear you reference it, on the language around when activities would be permissible, going back to, okay, you did. Okay, I see Ray nodding her head. Thank you.
I am good with advancing this to the full board for a second reading. Mr. Rose, Mr. Bass.
Me as well.
Okay. So that brings us to the first of the 400 series policies that we are going to look at. The policy 403, student discipline, 404, student rights and responsibilities, 407, removal of students from school area, and 408, suspension and expulsion. These are brought forward consistent with the instruction that we start with the oldest possible policy, the one that has been updated the least, the last updated. None of these are here today with proposed changes. What was included in board docs is just the current existing policy. And largely we decided that it made sense to bring this forward for information and discussion first. So Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders, who are both here in the virtual call, are able to hear what the board's interest is before they do the legwork in actually trying to make modifications. And so I'm largely going to turn the floor over to them because they are our subject matter experts on these two policies, or four policies rather. And I will start us off with policy 403, student discipline. So Mr. Falls or Mr. Saunders, would you kind of kick us off with the conversation, talk about the purpose of the policy and where it derives from?
Yield it to you, my friend. Sure. Yeah. Good morning, board members and committee members. The purpose of the policy for student discipline is really to codify that you have regulations on student discipline, which have recently been modified in alignment with the Code of Conduct, and that it reflects a philosophy that discipline is about teaching appropriate behavior and reinforcing and motivating that students to behave in the appropriate way. It really talks about the fact that suspension is a last resort option and that suspension should be used sparingly as a last resort. When I reviewed these, I looked at them through the lens of Code of Maryland regulations. There's nothing really that has changed in recent years that would require a change to this policy. And so we wanted to get your input as to whether you felt that there's too much information in the policy and that we already have covered that in regulation, or whether there's other information that you would like to include in your policy.
So Dana, Mr. Falls, can you move to your right just a little bit, because I've gotten some text feedback that you're off screen a little bit.
I can. Sorry, I on my screen it shows me. So, thank you.
And the truth is, he's really got a face for radio.
This is my colleague that I love and respect. So, board members, I would just open it up to you with comments or questions that you might have in regard to this policy. We will be reformatting this to the new formatting style. But before we did that, we really wanted to know if you had content changes that you felt strongly about that we would include.
Mr. Rose?
Mr. Rose?
Well, I guess maybe this is just an obvious observation, but should we reference the student code of conduct in the policy?
Yeah, that was something I picked up on as well, that we have in the section talking about the disciplinary regulations. And I think it would be easy to add it there. The regulations and the student code of conduct would include those following things.
I just had one like comment of maybe some language, well, for consideration, and then maybe a broader question for you, Mr. Falls. So one is maybe I'm wondering about under the board establishes that student disciplinary regulations at a minimum, and then there's the bullet points. I didn't see the language of like restorative practices in here, and I think that that's been a move that we as a district have tried to incorporate a lot into, you know, our student support and, you know, how we're approaching discipline. So I see conflict resolution in that first line, but maybe something around, you know, restorative practices as well, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it sure does.
Yeah. And then the other one was really just a broader question for you is, from your perspective, are there particular areas that you would recommend we tweak some language or look at a little bit deeper, just based on the policy? I think it's, you know, to me, it's broad in a good way, because then, you know, you reference the code of conduct, which definitely has a lot more specifics around particular areas of support that we're providing. But is there anything in here that you see that is maybe misaligned or that you would want to dig a little bit deeper as we consider additional policy updates?
So I'll preface what I'm about to say, and I know Mr. Saunders has something he wants to chime in with as well, that my philosophy typically with policy is that less is more, because it's spelled out more in the regulation, and in this case, in great detail in the code of conduct. And so to answer your question, Ms. Gallagher, no, I don't personally see anything that I feel like we need to add, but I believe Mr. Saunders has a comment.
Ms. Gallagher, one of the things I was thinking is that if you're familiar with the code of conduct, we spent the first 2 pages really defining the philosophy and the beliefs that you talked about. It talked about restorative, it talked about progressive, those kinds of terms. I see us looking at that as a basis for updating the policy. So it would be aligned that I would see that you would see the policy, and then if you went to the student code of conduct, you go, oh, yeah, they were created about the same time.
Mr. Bass?
The one bullet point that I'm struggling with a little bit is allowing for discretion and consideration of unique identifiers. So certainly, I am deeply concerned when we have disproportionate suspensions, disproportionate discipline. But right, the issue there would be that I think would be that the administrator would be enforcing discipline and suspension in different ways or different rates based on student background. And not that we actually want discretion based on gender or race or national origin. So I actually wonder if we need some sort of reworking there.
So I think that language actually came as a recommendation from the Equity Committee. And I will say that I want to be sure, Mr. Bass, that we don't conflate the discipline policy with the suspension policy, because discipline should be much more than suspension. Discipline should be about teaching. And that's where I believe that lens does come in. How we teach that behavior might be relevant to that student's experiences, to their life, to their mental health, to lots of factors that I believe we've captured in here. And so I think if we were suspending students based on that criteria, I would have concern with that, because that's more of a punitive approach. Although I do think those things even should be reflected on. What do you know about the student, and is suspension really the appropriate choice in the situation to change the behavior? But this is really intended about changing behavior. And so the reflection on the student as a whole, I think, is important for administrators to do in what strategies they are implementing to affect change in the behavior.
I like the points you're making. I guess two thoughts. One is that the next two bullet points do speak about suspension. So suspension is in some ways in the sauce there. But the other thing is, would small changes in language, such as allow for a holistic understanding of the student, or allow, something along those lines, would that help a little bit here? Allow for a holistic understanding of each student. And just a little tweak. I wonder if it would be helpful.
So again, I'm not opposed to any of that. It might run in conflict with the equity committee and recommendations that were made from them.
And maybe, I don't know if I can weigh in, because I think, to me, I agree with Mr. Bass, particularly around the word discretion, I think is the area. And I think we've heard from a number of teachers, for example, who are maybe responsible for doing some student discipline in the classroom or in the school building, that sometimes it feels like there is, and we know that there is some level of discretion that administrators have with addressing student discipline, but that it's not necessarily applied consistently. And sometimes that leads to some confusion or inconsistency in the school building. And so to me, it's maybe that word discretion that can maybe lead to some confusion. And so if we can clarify that and make sure that it aligns with the language that's used maybe in our updated student code of conduct.
Yeah, and we can certainly take a look at that. I will say that where COMAR talks about discipline, it emphasizes that administrators must be allowed discretion. And the only thing that discretion cannot be applied to is a firearm possession, because that's governed by federal law. Outside of that, principals must be given discretion in decision making about discipline. But we can look at that language and bring that back with the revision that you can consider, and then those members of the board that are also involved in the equity work may want to lens that as well.
And it may just be as simple as amending the language to say discretion in accordance with COMAR. So the community understands that the discretion is given by the regulation set forth by the state and not necessarily by the board itself. Mr. Rose?
Yeah, I would like to see that paragraph reworked just in its articulation, the way the language is. I mean, maybe, because you think about what the previous sentence leads to is at a minimum. I kind of would like to see, at a minimum, administrators will consider the unique identifiers of every student, blah, blah, blah. And then it might close with, and we'll use these identifiers in order to give discretion. I mean, but I would like to, I too have a bit of a problem when the third word in that sentence is discretion. I think discretion should be applied based on what follows in that paragraph. So I think discretion should actually be the last thing. I think administrators should give consideration to all the unique identifiers, and then based on those unique identifiers, have discretion. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then the last bullet point, again, just for clarity, I'd just like to see that sentence rewritten, because it says, at a minimum, explain why and how long-term suspensions or expulsions are last resort options. That doesn't sound like, we're supposed to be the what and regulation is the how. I just don't like how that sentence, are they are they supposed to explain to us each time? Are they? So I'd rather we
No, that-
state in policy that at a minimum, long-term suspensions or expulsions will be a last resort option. Because I don't understand the explain why part.
That is referencing the regulations will at a minimum explain why and how. So again, that goes to what's in the code of conduct. It's not the administrator who will explain why and how, but your regulations will explain why the suspension is used as a last resort. And again, that information is within the code of conduct.
And maybe that's why I'd prefer our bullet point to just be a statement of desire, which is long-term suspensions or expulsions will be a last resort option. Then in the regulation, they can cover how, why, that type of thing. Just my 2 cents on that. You know, our job is to say, here's what our expectation is, then you guys implement it.
Ms. Rose, as we work to revise this policy to apply the new template, because keeping in mind, right, this does not have the very clear articulated sections that our new policy has. This paragraph about the board establishing the student disciplinary regulation, establishing what you want in the student disciplinary regulations is really an implementation paragraph. What you're describing is really appropriate for what will be in a policy statement paragraph, that it is the policy of the board that that long-term suspensions or expulsions are last resort options. I mean, that's really what you're talking about, is articulating that as a policy statement and not as an implementation piece, or both.
No, thank you for that clarification. That's right on. Perfect.
Yep. So any other feedback on that particular policy? Okay, so then the next one, Steve, I don't know if you're ready to move on. Policy 404 is student rights and responsibilities. The one recommendation that I would make to you is, and this is again just a broad statement of that we will communicate annually the rights and responsibilities of students. And in the last paragraph, it says the superintendent shall ensure that the document entitled Student Rights and Responsibilities, we don't have a document entitled. The student rights and responsibilities are both in our informational calendar and in the student code of conduct, parent-student handbook.
It's no longer in the calendar.
It is in the full version on the calendar.
Okay.
It's not in the printed version.
And I think that's where we probably need clarification, because we don't know yet whether the student code of conduct will be something that is printed every year, or is it going to go to the first and only, or so those are the kinds of things that paragraph is something we probably need to think about. How do we notify students? Is it enough to have it on the website alone? So those are some of the questions that we have.
So, and again, COMAR requires that there's annual notification of rights and responsibilities. And so we have to figure out how that notification occurs. But it doesn't need to be in a document entitled Student Rights and Responsibilities. So that's the only feedback that I would provide, but I don't know if you have other questions or comments. Okay, hearing none, we can go on to 407, removal of student from school area. This actually is a little puzzling to me, and maybe Mr. Blivis can speak to it, but I'm not really sure why we have a board policy on removal of a student from school. Because that really is under the authority of the principal in regard to allowing somebody to take a student from school, and generally that's going to be with parent consent. But if we want to keep the policy, is there anything that you would want to change about it? Again, for me, it was a little unfamiliar to have a policy on removing a student from school. But Steve, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of history to give because, I mean, it is a 1-page, 3-paragraph policy that hasn't been updated since 2006. So I don't have a whole lot of history as to why this might be needed as a policy statement. Dr. Sergo, however, I will phone a friend and see if you want to jump in and share.
Sure, and I hope you can hear me okay. I think this is an example of a policy that is almost 20 years old that really at the time may have served a function, but now that we have a really robust regulatory structure and the guidance to schools around the notion of custody and how we sort of put children in the care of others is sort of a regulatory body of work. I would support deactivating this, but my question to the board and the group would be, is there any relevant anchor policy? And do we need, superintendent's regulations that spell out this work? Because this is about the implementation of court orders, which is really not a board policy.
I mean, I was just going to say, I think it would be helpful for us to see the regulation language that exists, if it does exist, around custody. It's confusing to me too. I mean, the title of removal of student from school area, I thought we were going to be reading a different type of policy under this, so the title of it is confusing. But I would say, before we make any decisions or recommendations around deactivating, that I think it would be important for this committee to see what exists in either regulatory language or if there's other related policies, because we've actually experienced a couple community concerns around custody related issues recently. And so I would want to see what we do have in place, whether it's in regulation or other related policies.
So my past history is that this type of information was included with standard operating procedure. It wasn't even in regulation. It was just standard operating procedure that we did with our legal team at providing schools guidance on how to navigate custody related matters. And we even had a chart about that removal and who has rights to do what. And we had developed that with the legal team, but that was provided to administrators. It wasn't in regulation or policy. So
Dana, I would agree with you. And I wanted to clarify my statement. I'm sorry. I think that at best, where I've seen it is in an attendance policy, or perhaps even in an enrollment policy. It would reference the notion of guidance for administrators that sort of lived and existed around how to address issues of custodial or non-custodial parents and things of that nature. So it's a reference point, but I do want to agree with Mr. Falls. It's typically, in my experience, been an SOP that was provided to administrators and furthermore referenced or anchored to either an enrollment or attendance policy.
Mr. Bass, you had your hand up earlier. Did you?
I just want to say I'm in agreement, Ms. Gallagher, with
Yeah, I think I'm also in agreement. I hate to be controlled by the social media environment, but it is what we have to deal with today. I would not be comfortable with just eliminating this policy without referencing, as Dr. Sergo has shared, that a line or two was moved into attendance or something like that. I agree with Mr. Falls that less is more, and I think this could have been one line that, court order and laws determine, that kind of thing. But I think we could move this into one of those other policies and reference that. because I'm a little surprised that they don't reference a regulation or a procedure. There's just nothing here. There's just a statement, and we don't reference that there's a standard operating procedure or there's a regulation or COMAR or whatever. So I would be comfortable with decommissioning it, but moving the language into another policy like we have done in the past, and limiting it to just a one paragraph that states, we're going along with regulation. But I think it's important in our always communication to the public that we're just not decommissioning a policy that is somewhat of a hot topic right now, that is important that we're moving it to another area where it's more appropriate. And so that's just my thought. And I agree. I would rather have seen it say release of student from the school area versus removal, because removal certainly has a negative connotation. But again, just talking about words.
Yeah, I think to your point, Mr. Rose, paragraph C is the closest to a policy statement of the three. It's bordering on it, but it's the closest, and it could easily be modified to incorporate a reference to except as may be provided for by an order of a court of competent jurisdiction.
Yeah, I was
And
going
then-
to say, Mr.
And then
Blivis,
relocated.
yes, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I would say what's important for the public and everyone to understand is that this is not an area of discretion. Our schools follow custody agreements and the legal rights of non-custodial versus custodial parents that are well established. And so even the idea that would be posited that a principal would, there are systems in place to make sure that we have the information, but schools only have the information that's given to them. Right. And so I think a lot of times where we see a tension point is when families have, maybe in not all cases, provided those anchors, or frankly, the unfortunate thing is not all families utilize the court system around making custody agreements. And then that creates some challenges for schools. And so our schools do not get to decide whether to follow a custody agreement. They have to follow what's there in the law. And I think just referencing those as the anchor documents would be important.
Thank you for that, and I agree. So yes, I would support that we move this language into another appropriate policy and then decommission 407.
Okay, I'll work with Mr. Blivis on that as to where that might best be found. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking in the attendance regulations would be the place for that, but we can work together on that. And the last policy that we have for you in the 400 series today is suspension and expulsion. And again, I do believe in less is more. The only recommendation that I would make to this policy is to add the information in regard to limitations of suspension of pre-K through second grade students. Again, that is governed under COMAR. That changed in, I believe, 2018. And that's not codified in your policy. It is in practice. It is in our code of conduct. But it's in regulation, but it's not in policy. And I think that might be something to state in policy.
I think the only thing I might add is also a cross-reference to the due process rights and appeal procedures that are reflected in policy 105.
I would support adding the language more about but I also wonder if we should look at modifying the language just a little bit on in-school suspension. I don't know that I would want necessarily a change in the practice, but the language feels either suspension has to be when arrested by inappropriate student behavior. I mean, ultimately, I support I hope you can hear me. I hear a
Mr.
background noise on
Yeah.
my-
Mr. Falls, can you mute yourself can you mute your camera while you're not?
Yeah, I'm sorry. And I cannot hear Mr. Bass.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else can.
I think it was a lot of your background noise that may have been part of the reason.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Thank you. One, I certainly support adding the Comar language regarding pre-K students. Two, should we modify the language just a little bit on in-school suspension? I think in practice, I would want the practice to be the same, but this does feel like language that would have been written a decade or two ago, and just to modernize the language a little bit and maybe have the same practice.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think as we are applying the new template with the definitions too, I think that will be helpful to have a definition of, in some of this might just like in-school suspension might just be a definition rather than part of the policy. But I agree. I think what was this like originally created in 1975? Is that
Yeah.
what's the date at the top? So yes, maybe modernizing some of the language, but I think it will be helpful for me and for this policy when we apply the new template to be more explicit in our definitions and update the language, and then more of the policy statement I think can be like that broader, like Mr. Falls was mentioning, not going too much into the weeds because it's referenced more in regulation.
Well, and truth be told, we actively discourage in-school suspension anyway, because in-school suspension is really only suspension when we do not provide educational services to the student. And it is rare that a student would be in school and we're not providing them educational services. And so we actively discourage the use of in-school suspension, because why would you have a student in school if you're not going to provide them instruction? And so I would not have any heartburn removing in-school suspension at all, because we don't tell administrators you may never do it, but because the law allows them to. But it would be rare that we wouldn't provide access to their instruction in-school removal, which is called in-school intervention, not in-school suspension.
I guess that was my question. So administrators can provide instruction to students in a different setting within the school, and that would be called in-school intervention. And that would be encouraged far more than an in-school suspension. Yeah.
That is correct. In fact, each year when we do our suspension data file to MSDE, I make personal phone calls to principals to say, this is showing as in-school suspension. Did you provide instructional services? Is that really what it was? And there are times when suspension is considered part of a student's discipline record. And so they want to codify it as an in-school suspension because they want that clearly on the discipline record. And so there might be a reason to do it. But I generally dissuade that, because why would we count it as suspension if indeed we provided the instructional support?
I really appreciate that clarification. And, I don't know if that means that in-school suspension is completely removed from this policy but yeah, it's encouraging to me to know that instruction is still provided in those circumstances, and the in-school intervention makes a lot of sense to me.
And I'd like to see that particular in-school intervention defined in the policy. I think that's I really appreciate Mr. Falls bringing that up, and so I think that would be well said if we added that as a definition to our policy. I don't know, as Mr. Falls mentioned, I don't know that we can fully remove in-school suspension since it's available in Comar, I guess. But I would like to see we go ahead and define our alternative.
Well, and just as this board has articulated its interest in progressive discipline for staff and what those levels of progressive discipline might look like, it's reasonable for the board to articulate the levels of student discipline in the same broad stroke manner, with it being the responsibility of Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders and the superintendent in her regulations and in the student code of conduct to kind of delve into the specifics of it.
Yes, and Mr. Bolivis, you're absolutely right. And we've done a lot of PL around that with the student code of conduct as well. And it is clearly defined in the student code of conduct. We can bring that definition into this policy if the board would like, so that there is that comparison of, this policy is about suspension, but here's an alternative to the suspension that can be utilized.
And just for record, it's on page 6 in the student code of conduct in the level of responses, and it's a level 3 response in the code of conduct, just for reference if you wanted to take a look.
Other suggestions or comments?
None from me. Thank you very much, Mr. Saunders, for that reference point too. I appreciate that.
So, okay, I turn it back over to you, Steve.
It would help if I come off mute.
Yep.
So that brings us to the last item on the agenda, item 1.10, policy and regulation library update. And I've been trying to figure out what the right word is: library, warehouse, the place where we keep all the policies on our website. And so what we currently use is this. This should be a familiar page for everybody. We have that one page with the Google Doc, which my team has been updating as we've been updating policies and regulations to capture those changes. And we have been working with our IT team to update the page you're looking at. And what I'm going to share with you now is a preview of it. It is not final. There are still some tweaks that I think we need to make within it. But we are really, I can't say wait, because I'm a big policy nerd and an IT guy, I am really excited about this. And what you see here is the changes to it. It now gives you the ability to sort by the last updated. So you'll be able to find the oldest policy or the newest change to the policy. We've also added this responsible offices section. And so if I go up to here and I change all and I choose human resources, it's going to sort by only the ones that are human resources related. And so now if you're looking for something that comes out of student services, which is Mr. Falls's department, if they are identified as a responsible office, you'll be able to sort by that. We picked just this one as a sample because we've still got updating to do. But this is, I think, a great change, something that's really going to help find information. And then I want to share, I'm going to kind of, it goes even further. When you click on the title, all of the changes that we make, this is where we're going to be able to capture them. So you won't have to go into the document to see the changes. You're going to see everything that goes in that summary page that we provide to the board or to the policy committee is going to live here as well in the revisions history. And I love this change. I'm super excited about the way the IT team was able to pull this together. And I am, I'm open if you have other suggestions or other things you'd like to see in this, but I am pretty excited about this.
I just want to say, it looks outstanding. I think that there are large and small ways that our school system is moving and becoming more user-friendly.
Dana, can you mute yourself?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I just want to say great job. Looks outstanding. More user-friendly. Yeah, I love it.
Ditto.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
say congratulations in helping FCPS move into the 21st century. I too am over the moon excited by this progress. So thank you so much.
Yep. I agree. I mean, we've been talking about transparency and communication, and this is, just another step for us and for the public to be able to easily find information and see what's been updated and how recently. So I love it. Go ahead, Ms. McNeish.
Yeah, from the CAC, it is a humongous thank you, because when we were charged with looking at policies and, oh, do I have to lower my hand? Sorry. I don't know. No, this is amazing, because when they said that, I think we all kind of glazed over and we thought, well, there's thousands of them, and how do we know what this means or where it comes from? And I think for someone who's not involved at all with any of this and they want to just look up something, they can kind of see the evolution, where it came from and where it is now and how we got there. I think it's brilliant. So just huge thank you from our whole entire committee, because I know this is super exciting for that group as well.
Well, like I said, the kudos goes to our IT team who pulled off these changes inside of a month. And there are still some tweaks that we need to, some little bugs that we need to figure out. Not the least of which is the Division of Legal Services is not the responsible office for every single policy or regulation. But yeah, no, I'm super excited about this, and I'm glad that I was able to present this to the committee today. And so with that brings us, I think, to the end of our agenda.
Mr. Davis, can I just ask a quick question in regards to our 400 series that we looked at today, 403, 404, 407, and 408? What is our time frame for bringing those back to this committee with the discussion that we've had today?
So our next meeting is January 24th. That is the next scheduled policy committee meeting. So I think that should give us more than enough time to come back with proposed changes. And then my intention is to add to the agenda with 1, 2, or 3, depending on how many we think we can handle for more information and discussion. Because when we're dealing with the 400 series policies, so much of it is driven by COMAR and by statute that it's really more helpful for us to hear what the board is interested in before we task the team with doing the work and making the modifications. So I mean, we'll bring these 4 back with proposed edits, and then we'll bring forward a few more to talk about what we want to do with them going forward.
Thank you. And the same for 101. Do you anticipate bringing that back in January as well?
Yes.
Mr. Falls?
I just wanted to clarify, it's not more than enough time, but it's enough time.
Fair enough.
I wanted to, before we signed off, I wanted to thank my colleagues and Mr. Blevis for scheduling this additional meeting. I think especially when you mentioned our next meeting, the next meeting of the policy committee isn't until January 24th, and you think about the work that was done today, I just want to thank the policy committee and our chair for having the attention that these are necessary meetings as we try to continue to live up to the charge from the full board to get through our policies and properly review them and be more transparent to the public. So thank you to all my colleagues for scheduling this. This was another valuable policy committee meeting.
Well, and I would like to thank the 3 members of the policy committee from the board, and Ms. McNeish as well, but you don't serve on the board. And because with the change, I don't know what the new committee is going to look like once January rolls around. It may be the 3 of you are back. It may be that there's 3 new individuals. And so I just want to express that I've enjoyed working with you on working through these policies and appreciate the support you've given me and my staff and the FCPS staff in processing this work.
Thank you, Mr. Blevis. It really has been great working with you and with my colleagues. And yeah, we've really viewed and reviewed many policies and I think really move forward in ways.
All right. Well, other than to say we'll see you all this evening because we have a special work session of the board to review policies that are
We sure
ready for
do.
first reading.
That sounds good. Then we shall adjourn unless there are any other. Looks like we're good. So see many of you this afternoon. Thank you all.